You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Friday, March 22nd, 2019. This week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we are talking about Jesus Christ as we work through our Lenten Jesus tree. We are talking in particular about the beginning of his public ministry. We've already talked about his baptism in the Jordan, his temptation in the desert, both of which affirmed his obedience to God the Father and how he embraced all that God had planned for him, including his suffering and death. We also started talking about the company that he kept. And although he kept people close to him, Jesus Christ was really very much alone during his time on earth, and yet he craved their companionship much as he wants your companionship through prayer. Yesterday, we started talking about the men that he called to be his 12 apostles, the people that were close to him, whom he taught specially and even sent out to preach on his behalf. Today we are going to look at another group of people that were also very close to Jesus, despite the fact that it probably seemed a little strange to the people at the time that he hung out with them. Today we are talking about the women that were close to Jesus during his public ministry. Now we get the names of several women. We know that his mother was oftentimes there. We hear that Mary Magdalene was often there. There's also other women that aren't named, and many women that come in and out of the stories asking for Jesus' help with healing or other matters. Now, why is it important, or why is it interesting even, that Jesus interacted with these women? Well, the time when Jesus lived a long time ago, men and women didn't necessarily interact a whole lot, especially if you were a devout follower of the Jewish faith. Most importantly, men and women did not practice or learn their faith together. For the most part, Jewish boys were instructed much more closely in the faith, reading the Torah and going to temple, and women were not. Also, it would have been very strange for a man to have a woman around listening to him teach about the faith, and yet Jesus oftentimes instructed women about the faith. Now, it's important for us to remember that Jesus didn't do this to be countercultural, to set some sort of a political movement in place or anything like that. No, Jesus included women in his ministry and his teaching simply because he loved them, because he saw them as valuable, as willing to believe and learn, and so he taught them. It is really that simple. Now, there are lots of stories about women in the Gospels. Of course, there's a story of Mary Magdalene, but there are also a couple of others. For example, there's a time when a Canaanite woman comes to Jesus and begs for the healing of her daughter. It's a bit of a confusing story, and Jesus' response is even confusing. It's steeped in symbols of the time that are hard for us to understand. But even though Jesus tells the woman that he is there to appeal to the lost children of Israel, meaning he's there to help, to preach, to teach the Jews only, and that the faith would be spread to those that weren't Jewish after he was gone, he has pity on her because of her faith. He heals her daughter. He listens to her. There's also another story where Jesus is on the way to raise a girl from the dead. You can imagine how exciting that would be and how the crowd was pressing around him to see this miracle. While he's on the way there, a woman who has suffered from hemorrhaging, meaning uncontrollable bleeding for years, and is suffering and has been to many doctors and had no relief from this suffering, where she reaches out and touches Jesus' cloak in total faith, knowing that if she touches him, she will be healed. What's interesting is not only that she is healed, that Jesus is so powerful that simply touching him in belief will lead to our healing, but it's that he turns, he looks for her, he knows her. Through what he says, it is clear that he understands the suffering that she has been going through. He heals her, he knows her. And now this is remarkable because this is a woman. At the time when Jesus lived, many men might think that women weren't worth being bothered about in this way. Of course, we know that that's the wrong way to think, but that was not necessarily something that people in Jesus' time believed. Now, we talk about the women included in Jesus' close company for one reason, and it's simply this. Jesus didn't give in to what society claimed was right or wrong. Jesus looked at each individual person. He looked at the faith that they demonstrated, the love that they demonstrated, and he loved them in return. It didn't matter if they were a Jew or a woman or a man or elderly or young or a leper. None of those things mattered to him. What mattered to Jesus was your faith and your love. And so, Sprouts, here is my challenge for you today. I want you to simply remember this. Remember this. We all have blind spots in our life. We all prefer to be with boys or girls, or we prefer to be with old people or young people. And we make judgments about people before we even realize that we're making judgments. I want you to simply reflect on where your prejudice might be. Do you have a group of people that you prefer to be with and a group of people that you avoid or exclude? Now, Jesus didn't have that. He looked at each and every person and simply assessed their faith and their love. So I want you to reflect on this, and I want you to reflect on the fact that Jesus loved every person he met. And this universal love is something that we can be striving for as well. That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. One final word to the grown-ups. Thank you so much for listening to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. I would like to invite you to join a special Facebook group just for those that listen to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. We will use this group to connect, to share resources around that week's theme, and simply celebrate raising future saints. To find the direct link to the Facebook group, simply check the notes for this podcast episode.